very much, and thanks very much to Russell for a really interesting and informative talk. Russell's talk was titled The Game Changer, and I suppose really that the theme of my talk this afternoon, it's change as well. This is the name of my book. It's a book that I wrote, Drugs 2.0, and I specialise in drugs and technology and the way that the web is changing, the way the world gets high. And so as you know, we've heard a lot in recent years about legal highs, and as we're in Liverpool, I thought I'd keep it topical. And so, you know, when we think of the Beatles, when we think of drugs, you know, what's the first substance for most people that kind of comes to mind? I think, you know, it's undeniable that drugs were a major part of the Beatles' lives, their sound and their cultural impact. I think the drug that most people would associate with the Beatles might be, say, LSD, and in fact, the first non-alcohol experience that the Beatles had was, according to the world's most respected Beatles historian, a guy called Mark Lewison. He said it was Benzedrine, a stimulant found inside nasal inhalers, and the Beatles would crack open the tubes, they'd suck on the stimulant-soaked inners, and they'd get a buzz for a few hours from it. So that was their very first kind of kick, you know. It was a legal high, so the Beatles were kind of pioneers in that as well. But the first drug that the Beatles really abused, that they really caned, it was another legal high, and that was a drug called phenmetrazine, trade name Preludin. And there they are. Now, when I found that picture, I needed to know what it was. It fascinated me. I just thought, what is this drug? What are these? What's going on? Look, I mean, look at John Lennon, you know. He's off his nut. I mean, you know, that's Pete Best over there. I don't think that Pete took as many as the rest of the band. But, I mean, Paul McCartney as well. He's got a gown on, you know. And you know, they look high, and so I thought, okay, but what's the story behind this picture? And this is a photograph that was taken by the bouncer, a guy called Horst Forscher, at the Star Club in Hamburg in the Reaper Bar in 1962. And it said that the Beatles' manager Brian Epstein kept this picture hidden for years and years. And I did think how different the world might have been if that picture had got out in 1962. You know, what kind of impact would it have had on their careers if they'd been known as drug abusers, you know, these cheeky, handsome young men? This kind of youthful indiscretion today, you know, that would be on their Facebook page. And, you know, it's enough to make you feel sorry for Justin Bieber, really, well, almost. But might the Beatles still have conquered America? You know, the US media at that time, after decades of crooners like Perry Como, Frank Sinatra, you know, they were scandalised by the Beatles' fringes, never mind a drug habit. So how would they have reacted if they'd known, you know? But, you know, the Beatles were in really good company. Amphetamines and other stimulants like this were taken by everyone, from British housewives to presidents. So phenmetrazine was also abused by the great and good. JFK loved it, Marilyn Monroe, Elvis Presley, Truman Capote. Now, Jack Ruby, the guy that shot Lee Harvey Oswald, who was said to have shot Kennedy, Ruby was off his nut on phenmetrazine when he shot when he shot Lee Harvey Oswald, excuse me. So it was prescribed widely all over the world as a slimming tablet. It's the way that many illegal highs start out, isn't it, as pharmaceutical drugs. So in the UK, in August 1966, this talk's going to go all over the place in time, and it's going to have flashbacks and all kind of jumpy stuff, you know. So in the UK, August 1966, Labour MP Rennie Short told the House of Commons, in 1965, there were 2 million prescriptions for pep pills, as they were called, 400,000 more than in 1964. So there's nothing new under the sun, is there? Prescriptions for tranquilizers went up by 1.9 million prescriptions to 9 million prescriptions for tranquilizers in the UK at that time. And so we might laugh at that. We might think that that's an antiquated kind of foolish way to have policy. But if you look at the US today, in 2010, the prescriptions for Adderall, a drug that is active at 20 milligrams, there were 84 tons prescribed of Adderall in the US in 2010. So phenmetrazine, Preludin, it came in the form of small pressed tablets, and they each as well contain 25 milligrams. And the Beatles were given it by the girls who worked the cloakrooms in the Star Club, and they were also given it by the photographer, Astrid Kircher, and she got them off her mum. She used to nick them off her mum. So each of the band would take 1 or 2, but John Lennon, he liked to hit it hard, and he'd go through 5 or 6 and end up frothing at the mouth and ranting awake for days. So phenmetrazine was, you know, obviously people don't take drugs for bad, just for the bad effects. There's a good side as well, and they were intensely euphoric and kept you going for hours. It enabled the Beatles to turn out set after set of rock and roll, and it helped them hone their art and probably with a skin full of German lager as well. And that helped them to deal with the crowds of drunken sailors and whoever else was there. And it was their time in Hamburg that helped them to become the band that conquered the world. And, it changed them, their time in Hamburg. It changed the way they looked, it changed the way they sounded, it changed the way they behaved. And it's this drug, phenmetrazine, that inspired my latest investigation into legal highs and the way that the web is changing the international drug markets. So, I think it's probably important for me to say why I'm interested in this story. Around about 2008, I lived in Colombia, and at that time the country was producing around 60% of the world's cocaine, about 600 tons a year. And I was a freelance correspondent. The drug was tied in inextricably with the civil conflict it had waged for 40 years. And it's the world's longest running Marxist insurrection. I was fascinated by that. It's a civil war, though in many sort of discourses it's presented as a terrorist uprising. And the guerrilla financed part of their campaign with the export of cocaine, and by taxing farmers who grew the coca leaves in farms on their territory. So Marxist cocaine dealers, it's a really interesting concept. And I decided I wanted to visit a coca plantation I wanted to see for myself. I'm a journalist and I want to see. So I persuaded a councillor in the Caribbean town of Cartagena to let me accompany the United Nations on a day trip with, well, ended up being 3 days, with what are called arrancadores, which means uprooters. And their job was to go into the fields and to pull up the coca plants by the roots and to destroy the plantation, and there they are. So I wanted to see this. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. This was the kind of United Nations attempt to control the international cocaine industry. So, some kind of facts about the cocaine industry. If you've got a hectare of coca leaves, which is a couple of football pitches, it's variable, but you can get, like, say, 5 or 6 kilos per hectare. Or rather, 5 or 6 kilos of pasta basica, which is then refined down to about 4 kilos of cocaine hydrochloride. Now, in Colombia, that's sold for £1,500 a kilo. That 5 kilos will end up on the streets of Liverpool as around 25 kilos. So, the economies of scale come in. Now, each of those kilos in Liverpool are sold wholesale at about £30,000, on retail at about £50,000. Obviously, there's different deals going down. So that one field in Colombia, this one field gave the farmer about £5,000, and it gave Scouse gangsters about £1.25 million. So that's one field, and there are hundreds of thousands of fields like this in Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia. So I'm there in the middle of this field, shaking from head to toe with exhaustion and dehydration, and there's bomb dogs running the perimeter looking for explosives, and the snipers taking up the position all over the field. And so it was just a really unusual scene. And I found a cocalero, the old guy who owned this field, and I said to him, so what are you going to do? We're destroying your livelihood. We're pulling it up. What are you going to do now? You've got kids. What are you going to do? And he said, well, and I quote, he said, as soon as they're gone, I'll be planting more coca in the next field. He said, I'd like to grow coffee, but that takes 7 years. This bush grows back in 9 months, and it produces leaves every 60 days. And rice, he said, sells at $25 a hundredweight. It takes 5 months of hard work, and I need to transport it by river. That costs a lot. Coca paste, he said to me, goes for $1,500 a kilo, and the plant needs no attention. What would you do? And I had no answer for him, and I don't think any of us would. What would you say to the guy? And it seemed the most incisive comment on the drugs war that I'd ever heard. It just amazed me. So previously, what had led to this situation was that in the early 2000s, the US government had sprayed Colombia with glyphosate, it's a napalm-like substance, to wipe out the farms, I'm sure you know. Lots of other food crops were caught up in the spraying campaign, and the farmers were so skint, and they were struggling to feed their families, that they had no choice but to plant more coca. So the coca farmers then relocated to the national parks, and the tourists couldn't visit, and that meant that Colombia got even poorer, as tourism all but dried up, and the war got worse. So it seemed an endless cycle, and it seemed incredibly naive of the UN to me to think that by pulling up the plants, they could eradicate the problem. It was counterproductive, it was futile, and it cost tens of thousands of dollars that day. And cocaine consumption, correspondingly at this time in the UK, was not being tackled in any meaningful way. Demand was still high. And I was seeing the impact of the production, the environmental impact of the production, the prohibition, all over Colombia, and the prices in the UK and the EU, they dropped, and the drug moved from being the kind of thing that rock stars did to becoming a drug that was really commonplace. And attacking supply in Colombia did nothing to reduce demand, and it grew. And this circular, relentless, slightly insane story completely fascinated me as a journalist. So I looked into it. Okay. So this next section of the story is kind of around the same time in the UK, and it's 2008, and it's set between the UK and Cambodia at this point. So how does Cambodia come into the legal high story? How does Cambodia come into the drug story even? Well, the United Nations decided to clamp down on the illegal saffron industry in Cambodia at that time. And saffron is an essential oil, and it's just a few steps from that oil in a decent laboratory to make MDMA. So there's loads of other ways, but this is the best one. It's favoured for its simplicity. So it's also the most watched substance on the planet. If you try to buy 10 kilos of saffron, then you'd be nicked instantly straight away. It's on a watch substance list. It's used for one thing, and that's making MDMA. And so unless you go to Phnom Penh, downtown Phnom Penh, you can buy it for a few dollars a litre, because in Phnom Penh it's sold from the nearby Cardamom Mountains, and it's extracted from the roots of the yellow camphor tree. It's really easy. You just cut down a few miles of rainforest, and then you use that to burn underneath a huge cauldron, which looks a bit like this. And that's how saffron is made as a precursor for MDMA. And so the UN knew that the Cambodian smugglers were doing this, and quite rightly they stopped them from destroying this beautiful patch of rainforest. And they destroyed 33 tons of saffron in mid-2008. This is kind of a historical, how did we get to the point that Russell's at? How do we get from a position where there was no legal highs? How do we get from there to the point where we've got so many different chemicals? And it's things like this that play the part in it. So when that was banned, when that 33 tons of saffron was banned, that knocked out the MDMA supply for Europe. And that was 245 million pills. So from one day to the next, suddenly there was no MDMA in Europe. And so I noticed this because I was kind of trawling websites and social media and looking around and just generally being interested in the subject. And at this point, the net hadn't taken complete centre stage in people's lives. You know, you could still go to the pub and people wouldn't be checking the email. You know, it wasn't like, you know, this kind of Twitter mania that people are in now. So as the MDMA sort of drought gripped Europe, there was the seizures, to give you some idea of the figures, were down to 25% of what they'd been previously. So there was no MDMA. And something else at the same time was in really short supply in Europe and in the EU and in the US, and that was money. So when the worldwide credit markets in 2008 went belly up, the pound suddenly lost 25% of its value against the euro and against the dollar. Now, those are the currencies that you buy cocaine in. If you want to buy cocaine, you need dollar bills or euros or AK-47s. You know, you can't turn up with your Switch card or with a Visa card. So suddenly, what you had in the UK was that cocaine quality plunged, and border agency and other staff confirmed that to me. And there was no MDMA, and cocaine didn't work. And into this gap stepped methadone. That's when methadone emerged. So as soon as that gap appeared, a novel psychoactive substance, a legal high, a research chemical, call it what you will, came to fill that gap, and it became the 4th most popular drug in the UK within a few months, really fast. And after more time, I'd tell you that story, but I'm sure many of you know it inside out. But I think for me, my favourite thing that emerged out of that time was the madness of seeing Telegraph and Guardian editorials calling for greater legislation around this drug, and at the bottom of them, underneath, were adverts for dialogram services, so that you could read your article and then you could order your drugs. And that showed me that there was this kind of confluence of technology and culture, and it was, that was because Google AdWords and Google AdSense, people were paying Google to sort of appear, to sell an advert every time that the word methadone appeared, so that was how it crossed over. It was kind of surreal. So you've got this kind of confluence of technology, drugs and culture, each of them changing the other, and it's kind of, there was an evolutionary pressure. It was mutating and developing, and the system was becoming really dynamic at that point in 2008. So, sort of coming up to date in the last 5 years, we've seen startling developments in the drug market and a kind of correspondingly deeper entrenchment of the web in our everyday lives. And so, in 2008, I'd been online for years. I'd been watching the take-up of internet shopping, and I knew it wouldn't be long before someone somewhere came along and found a way to use the net to sell drugs. And so when methadone appeared and was sold to anyone with a PayPal account, I realised it was a kind of tumultuous period of change, and I decided to document it. And that's how I came to write my book, Drugs 2.0. And so let's kind of recap from there. So we've got this position where methadone suddenly comes to the market. We've had novel psychoactive substances come to prominence. And then I've published my book, and I'm looking for ways to expand the story and to see what's happening next, to find out what's going on. And let's go back to femmetrazine. Basically, I decided that everyone was claiming that the manufacture of like novel psychoactive substances and legal highs was a really simple thing. Everyone said they take a drug and then they add a molecule and then it's made legal. And I thought, okay, everyone's saying that. Is it true? Is that actually true? Is that provably, demonstrably, can I have evidence of it? Because you can't, let's say amphetamine, you can't just take amphetamine and add a fluorine molecule to it and make it legal. Well, you can add the fluorine molecule. It makes a drug called 2-fluoroamphetamine. Very effective drug, but it's illegal in the UK. British drug laws are not that sort of dense, you know. The chemists that write these laws are really quite bright. It's just the chemistry is so incredibly complicated. So I thought, what then? Could I take, I was working for a magazine called readmatter.com, matter.com. And I was working with a great editor there, and we discussed, would it be possible to make a legal drug for a story? Could we do it? So I thought, okay, what drug would be really what would illustrate that really interestingly, the change in the drugs market? So I decided to try to make a legal version of femmetrazine, the drug that the Beatles took. I thought, what better way could there be to illustrate that? But the key thing we wanted to know was how easy is it and how much have things changed? And the answer surprised me. What we were intending to do was commission a very interesting kind of custom synthesis. Now, my chemistry is not that great, so I called up a friend and I asked him and said, what can I do? Is this possible? And he told me it was. And from there, I simply Googled custom synthesis and up-popped a load of companies in China who claimed they could do it. I phoned dozens of them and had some really unusual conversations, actually. I was on Skype in the middle of the night talking to laboratories in Shanghai and Hangzhou, and I was pretending to be making dog medicine. I said that I was a dog medicine manufacturer and that I wanted to make a new drug for dogs, and that was my cover story. But I didn't need a cover story. The guy didn't care. He didn't care. He just wanted the business. All I actually did was open a Gmail account. Technically, that's how I prepared. I opened a Gmail account. That was it. Nothing more. So there was no due diligence on his side. So I decided on this place, and I'd show you some of the laboratories that I found, but I'm going to go through the next 3 slides really quickly because I don't want anyone to take any photographs of them, if that's okay. But this is the laboratory that I ended up choosing, okay? So we'll go through them very quickly. And I'll put some identifying features up there. Okay. So I clicked through those quickly to show that it was a really professional outfit. It wasn't some tin pot laboratory. It wasn't a student. It was a proper pharmaceuticals laboratory. And I contacted them and I said, I need you to make me this drug for dogs. And he was quite happy to. And I wanted a really good lab. So once I had it sorted, things moved really fast. Now, we decided to make femmetrazine legal by adding a simple methyl group, and that's 1 carbon atom and 3 hydrogen atoms to the basic skeleton of femmetrazine. Femmetrazine is just a stimulant. So this meant that the drug would be legal in the UK, and it would probably still act as a stimulant, but that really wasn't my concern, to be honest. I just wanted to make a legal version of it. But we didn't actually make femmetrazine and then add that group. We just followed the recipe that would result in that new form being made. So a few weeks later, the lab asked me for some money. They wanted me to pay up front, so I agreed that I'd pay them up front, and then the deal was on. And they made me back inside a few weeks, and they said, yes, we've made it. We've made 6-methylfemmetrazine. It's now here. It's ready. So they sent me this. And that's HPLC. That's a chromatography rendering of what the drug involves. And that spike in the centre, what that says is that there's only this drug present in this bag. So anyway, we needed to get it into the country. And they were kind enough to offer delivery to the UK as part of the money that I'd paid for the synthesis. And it was fantastic customer service. It really was. I've had far worse service from Tesco. They were wonderful. They didn't even ask when I was going to be in or anything. It was cool. So I got that sorted, and I needed to choose a delivery spot. I needed somebody to. I didn't want to deliver to my house. I wanted to do this in an anonymous way as I could. And so I went to a mailboxes firm. I got the package delivered there. I gave a false name, false address, paid in cash, got the key, job done. And then we had it arranged to be delivered by a courier firm. And there was this weird moment when I was actually watching it going around the world, being tracked. And I could actually track the delivery of a drug that I'd designed in a laboratory in China. It just seemed again, like science fiction. You know, I was actually watching the tracking device on the thing. So he sent it to me in the end as metal cleaning powder. I had to go and collect it, which was a bit weird and a bit sort of sketchy, because wandering around on the tube in London with bags of white powder is not a good idea. It hadn't been opened, the package was delivered, and it's just, you know, it's one of millions of pieces of post that go through the mail every single day. You know, there's 90 pieces of domestic mail in the UK, 90 million pieces of domestic mail in the UK every day. So I got it home, the drug came home, and I photographed it. There it is. Bag of white powder, could be anything. Could be absolutely anything. I mean, you know, I didn't know at this point if he'd sent me salt or monosodium glutamate, or if he'd sent me a banned drug or anything. So what I needed to do was have it tested, so I decided to get in touch with a really great chemist, a guy called Andrew Westwell at Weddinos in Cardiff University, sort of chemistry department. And that was set up, it was a Welsh Government initiative set up with Andrew Westwell and a guy called Dr. David Caldicott, who's going to come in the story again. And Westwell examined it and got back to me and he said, yes, you know, you've got a very pure sample of 6-methylphenmetrazine. The lab had actually done exactly as we asked. So how easy was it? Well, we'll come to that, but it happened, and it was, they did what they said they would. They didn't rip me off. They made me a new legal high. And so, you know, John Paul, George and Ringo would have been very happy indeed. Maybe not Ringo. So that's how it did it. That was how the investigation went down. So how easy was it? Well, it depends on your viewpoint. It was quite complicated, you know. It was kind of concierge drug design. It was like room service drug design. I just phoned up and had it made. And I'm not boasting here, but no one in this room could have done it in the time frame that I did, and that's not because I'm particularly clever, but because I've been working on stories like this since I first covered methadone. I've made a lot of contacts, done a lot of research, a lot of learning. But I would argue, and this is where the real kind of concept of change comes through, the change now is that anyone that wants to do this can do this. Anyone that sets themselves that goal, they can do it. It's possible, rather than being completely impossible. And, you know, I was paid for the investigation, so that meant that I could dedicate myself to it day and night. Legally, it was easy for me to do because it's impossible to legislate against every single substance and every single modification. And catch-all laws that kind of ban all molecular manipulation, they're too hard to write. So you can ban drugs, but you can't ban chemistry. And I think that's the kind of the key message from this. And if you want to shut down the web, then you'd have to shut down business, banking, travel, health services. You know, think about it, it can't be done. Practically, it was really simple. All I needed was a phone, a net connection, a PO box. And I could have done it in an internet cafe for £1 an hour if I wanted to. I could have just sat for £1 an hour. So in terms of personal danger as well, there was none. You know, I wasn't in a field in Colombia surrounded by snipers and dogs. It was fine. There was, you know, the lab didn't know my name. They never knew anything about me. But really, the point is about the motivation. It's not so much just about how easy it is. It's like this kind of risk, it's cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? It's like, what would be the rewards for me if I was to have this drug synthesized by the kilo, rather than 5 grams as I did there? What would the rewards be? I could sell that drug for probably £50 a gram, no problem. And then I think I'd probably have 6 months to a year before it was banned. So, you know, I could make a 50-fold return on my investments if I wanted to. And I know that the drug will actually work because the guy that gave me the synthesis, he tried it himself in the 80s. So, given the right kind of hype from newspapers, politicians and other moral panic merchants, or if supplies of MDMA and cocaine vanished as they did in 2008, and if it was as powerful and popular as methadone, I'd only have to sell 20 or 30 kilos retail and I'd be a millionaire in 6 months. Job done. I'll move quickly on. So the question of ease is kind of irrelevant, you know. It's like the question instead should be, what are people's motivations in this? And under current legal paradigms, it's a rational business decision. It's a completely rational business decision to get involved in this industry. The ethics of it, though, are a different matter altogether. So what does it mean? You know, this is what's happened. We've made the drug. We've got it into the UK. It exists within this context. What does it mean, though? What does it actually mean? So let's look back again to the 60s, back to the era of the Beatles. Let's look at Woodstock. So in Woodstock in 1969, 500,000 people gathered for a week-long crazed festival of sex, drugs and rock and roll. And how many people do you think died at Woodstock? There were two people died out of 500,000 in a week. And, you know, it wasn't a really moderate event, I wouldn't say, Woodstock. You know, I think they were probably having something a little stronger than a cup of tea. But, you know, let's bring right up to date again for another flash forward. In September in 2013, at the Brownstock Festival, which had 5,000 people present in South Woodham-Ferrers in Essex, not quite such a bacchanal of bohemia and hippiedom, but still a party. And there was a guy there, a guy called Jonathan Graham, an IT manager from Chelmsford, England, and he was described by his friends and colleagues as Mr. Dependable, an IT manager, you can imagine the guy. And he died. He died at that festival. Now, the post-mortem is inconclusive, but the drug that he took, 5-EAPB, is one of the drugs that replaced 6-APB that Russell mentioned earlier. So these are the consequences, and this is what it means. So if you look at, say, again, just this year, June 10, this year, 6-APB was banned, 5-MEPB came to the market a day later. That was soon banned. The very next day, 2 new drugs, 5-EAPB, the one that killed our IT manager at the Brownstock Festival, that appeared on the same day. And the government's response has been completely inadequate. I mean, they've brought in temporary controlled drug orders, but that's done nothing to stem the flow of innovation and the proliferation of new drugs. So, you know, this innovation is constant and is consistent. And some of the numbers that I have here, Russell actually broke down earlier, so I'll spare those again. But let's look at it again, and let's say in the last 4 years, we've had 243 new compounds have been identified. That's more than a ban in the United Nations 1971 International Convention on Psychotropic Substances. Well, actually, it's 244 if you count mine, you know? So, actually, it's 247 since I started writing this document a few days ago. You know, there are now plenty of new legal substances out. One of them is a legal version of LSD. So, you know, we could have started with LSD in this topic, but, you know, reality overtook art. So, you know, LSD started out as a legal high, if you want to look at it that way. Same as phenmetrazine, both of these drugs are now legal. And, you know, there's a new drug, AL-LAD, that one's now on sale. There's another one, LSZ. There's a new beta-ketone derivative of 2CB. The innovation is endless, it's relentless, it's impossible to control. And so, you know, is this really the way that we as experts, analysts, advisors, academics think that we should be driving policy? You know, I would argue that we're confusing cause and effect on an epic scale. The reason that more drugs are appearing than ever before is because we're banning more drugs than ever appeared. You know, but we've got the whole telescope the wrong way around. It seems obvious to me that the two facts are connected. So, to conclude, we've seen the way that the legal highs market emerged and where it's going. And we've seen in recent weeks, even as the FBI took down the Silk Road, where every drug known to humankind was sold, it re-emerged in just a few weeks. I interviewed the owner of the Silk Road just a week ago, and there's little danger that this market is here to stay and that this way of selling drugs on the dark web, on the anonymous internet. There are now 7 different dark markets that I know of. In fact, possibly 8. I'm not quite sure. And with the rise of the anonymous internet, I mean, this is what an online drug deal looks like in 2013. Looks like that. And that's me ordering some heroin. I'd like 3 grams of heroin. That's the encrypted text. That's the decrypted. If you want to decrypt that text, it would take you something like, well, it's 1 followed by 256 zeros of combinations of what that could mean. So encryption, the dark internet, these are the new frontiers, as well as the new drugs. So, you know, you can buy heroin, crack, ecstasy, cannabis, whatever you want, no questions asked. You don't even need to leave the house. And if anyone has seen the newspapers today, the consequences of that are as any uncontrolled, unregulated, unthinking access to drugs. We have a 17-year-old boy, Patrick McMullen. He took half a gram of MDMA and 3 tabs of LSD that he bought from the Silk Road. Now, if he's bought it from the Silk Road, the quality of those drugs was probably really high. And he's taken half a gram of MDMA, which is an enormous quantity of MDMA to take. And he's taken 3 tabs of LSD, which is, you know, he's probably never had real LSD in his life. So we have this sudden access to dangerous and, you know, enjoyable drugs, because let's not deny it, people that take drugs do it not because they're damaged or in a bad way, they're doing it to have fun. And so it's a strange kind of moment where we have this drive to human hedonism and the access to the tools of hedonism with absolutely no barriers, absolutely none. You don't even need to leave the house. And what I'd argue is that over the course of the century or so that drug laws have existed in any meaningful form, a clear pattern has emerged, and it's this: as each law to prevent drug consumption is made, a means to circumvent it is sought and it's found. And those means can be chemical, legal, social, or technological. And today we stand at a crossroads formed by those 4 elements, with the web making possible communication between distant strangers, and it facilitates the sharing of limitless quantities of information, and it enables the distribution of drugs anywhere in the world. And currently what we've done is we've outsourced responsibility to criminals, dealers, gangsters, and drug-obsessed internet psychonauts for our drug policy. And that's who's controlling our drug policy and our information right now. They're the ones who are in control, because the government isn't. And so I'd argue, to return to the theme of change, that it's time for change. It's time to change the drug laws that have failed to reduce consumption. They've failed, certainly, to kill demand. They've failed to reduce harm. They've failed to reduce supply. They've failed to prevent the proliferation and emergence of ever more dangerous drugs in our society. Even I can make them, So one of the guys I've been speaking to, Dr. David Caldecott, he gave me a great analogy. He said, if we see drugs as an illness and prohibition as an antibiotic, he said, if you treated any illness with the same antibiotic for 50 years, medical people would be astounded if resistance had not developed. And that's what's happened. It's a resistance. And the only reason that legal highs exist is because of drug laws. It's a paradox. So more laws banning them are not the answer, Instead of that, instead of uncontrolled substances, I believe that we need controlled substances. I think that we need to have supply, distribution, purity, consumption. We need all of those regulated. We need them taxed. We need them controlled, and we need the population educated. And this week I've been reading news sources again, looking back to Colombia. And if it seems unthinkable that we can have such a dramatic change in our society, let's look back to Colombia. Let's think about what's gone on in Colombia in the last week. And just this week, it's been a surreal week. After 50 years of civil war and 50,000 deaths, Ivan Marquez of the FARC told the Reuters news agency that the FARC are intent, the guerrilla, are thinking of putting down their weapons. They're going to do that. And the quote from Marquez is actually worthy. He says, "We are doing well. In no other peace process have we advanced as much as we have here in Havana." This is the guerrilla Marxist cocaine dealers, yeah? And they're saying, we've taken an important step in the right direction to end the conflict and achieve a real democracy in Colombia. And so I would argue that, if the civil war in Colombia could be negotiated to an end in my lifetime, and if you have sort of brave presidents of Latin America like Jose Mujica of Uruguay arguing that marijuana should be sold for recreational use for $2 a gram to undercut organised crime, a rational approach by a man who gives 90% of his salary away every single month to charitable causes, I remain optimistic that we can, in defiance of the US, I'm optimistic that we can overhaul our outdated drug laws. And I think we might, just after 40 years of bloodshed, make some peace.
Yeah.